Claire and Daniel Reeves were the couple everyone in Clearwater Bay envied: successful, attractive, and raising their young son in a home that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But behind the manicured lawns and perfect smiles was a secret that would shatter their picture-perfect life. It began with the arrival of Sophie Miller, the nanny who seemed to fit seamlessly into their family. Within months, whispers of stolen glances and late-night meetings would spiral into betrayal, rage, and a deadly confrontation that left one of them lying lifeless on the kitchen floor. Daniel Reeves had always been the man everyone in Clearwater Bay looked up to. He was polished, charming, and dependable, the kind of person who shook hands with neighbors and remembered their kids' birthdays. His career as a real estate agent had flourished over the years, and with it came a lifestyle that many in the small coastal town envied. He drove a sleek black SUV, wore tailored suits, and seemed to have it all: a beautiful wife, Claire, and a lively 3-year-old son named Noah. To anyone looking in, the Reeves family was picture perfect. But beneath the surface of that idyllic image, small fractures had begun to form, invisible to outsiders yet slowly widening with each passing week. Daniel's job had always been demanding. His days were filled with client meetings, property showings, and late-night phone calls that often spilled into weekends. Claire, who had once enjoyed the fast pace of their life together, now found herself exhausted and lonely. Caring for Noah was a full-time commitment, and she was also trying to keep up with her freelance graphic design projects. Most days, she barely had a moment to herself. She loved her son fiercely, but the isolation that came with motherhood had started to feel like a silent cage. The couple rarely spent quality time together anymore. Meals were eaten in silence, conversations were short and distracted, and the warmth that once defined their relationship had cooled into something polite but distant. When Claire suggested hiring a nanny, Daniel didn't hesitate to agree. It seemed like the perfect solution. Someone could help with Noah, freeing Claire to focus on her work and giving Daniel peace of mind knowing their son was well cared for during his long absences. They posted an ad, interviewed several candidates, and finally settled on Sophie. She was 25, energetic, and had glowing references. Her smile was warm and inviting, her presence immediately putting Noah at ease. On her first day, she arrived with a tote bag full of children's books and a friendly determination to win over the little boy. Claire felt relieved. Sophie seemed professional, responsible, and genuinely interested in her job. At first, everything went exactly as planned. Sophie took Noah on walks to the park, made him healthy lunches, and read to him in the afternoons. Claire could hear Noah's laughter drifting in from the living room while she worked in her small home office. She felt a flicker of gratitude towards Sophie for giving her some breathing space. Daniel also noticed Sophie's efficiency and her way with Noah, and he appreciated how smoothly the household seemed to run. But what began as professional admiration slowly morphed into something else, something neither of them acknowledged at first. It started with fleeting glances. Daniel would come home earlier than expected, claiming he had wrapped up work ahead of schedule, and find Sophie in the kitchen preparing Noah's dinner. Their conversations were casual at first, updates about Noah's day, light comments about the weather, but Daniel found himself lingering just a little too long before heading upstairs. He noticed how Sophie's hair caught the afternoon light and how her laughter was softer, more deliberate when directed at him. She, in turn, began to sense his attention. It wasn't overt, but it was there, like an unspoken current between them. Claire, absorbed in her own work and the constant demands of motherhood, didn't see the subtle changes right away. She was simply grateful for the help. On days when Daniel came home early, she assumed he was trying to be a more present father. She didn't notice the way his mood seemed lighter on those evenings, or how Sophie's eyes would briefly meet his before she excused herself for the night. It was all small, quiet things. A smile held a moment too long, a casual brush of hands while passing a plate, but they began to form a chain of moments that neither Sophie nor Daniel wanted to break. Over the weeks, the connection between them deepened in a way that was hard to define yet impossible to ignore. Daniel started finding reasons to be home during the day, claiming he needed to make calls from his office or handle paperwork that didn't require him to be on site. Claire didn't question it. If anything, she was glad to see him around more often, thinking maybe they were finally finding a better balance. Sophie remained professional in front of Claire, never crossing boundaries in her presence. But when the two of them were alone, there was a shift. It wasn't just the way they looked at each other, it was the way they moved around each other, the closeness in their proximity, the ease with which they seemed to fall into quiet, private rhythms. Daniel told himself it was harmless. He reasoned that he was simply enjoying pleasant company after years of emotional distance from his wife. Sophie, for her part, didn't push for anything more, but neither did she back away. They were caught in a dangerous middle ground, not yet a physical affair, but far beyond the boundaries of loyalty and trust. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground beneath them was unstable, but feeling too drawn to the view to step back. In the midst of this subtle shift, Noah thrived under Sophie's care. He laughed more, learned new words, and seemed happier. Claire often credited Sophie for this change, praising her dedication and warmth. She had no idea that the very person she trusted most in her home was becoming a silent wedge in her marriage. The thought hadn't even crossed her mind, not yet. One late afternoon, Daniel arrived home to find Sophie sitting with Noah on the living room floor, building a tower of wooden blocks. Claire was upstairs finishing a project. Sophie looked up, and their eyes met. It was a brief moment, but there was something in it, a spark, an unspoken acknowledgement of the tension they'd both been feeling. Noah knocked over the tower, and they laughed together, their shared glance lingering just a second too long. Daniel felt a rush of something he hadn't felt in years: excitement, danger, the thrill of being noticed. It was intoxicating. From that day on, things moved forward with a subtle but steady momentum. A shared joke in the kitchen, a quick touch when passing in the hallway. Neither of them said a word about what was happening, but both understood exactly what it was. And while Claire remained unaware, the walls of the perfect life she believed she had were already beginning to crumble, brick by silent brick. Claire could no longer dismiss the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just a passing suspicion anymore, it was an undercurrent that seemed to run through every part of her day. She caught herself watching Daniel when he thought she wasn't looking, noticing the way his eyes sometimes flicked towards Sophie with a quickness that felt practiced, as if he had trained himself to be subtle. She noticed the faint change in his posture when Sophie entered the room, the way his voice softened slightly when he spoke to her. These weren't things you could measure or prove, but they were there, and they lingered in Claire's mind long after the moments had passed. One morning, while Noah sat at the table eating his cereal, Claire scrolled through her phone, pretending to check emails. She was actually thinking about the receipt she had found in the desk drawer, the lunch with S. Taylor that Daniel had never mentioned. She had thought about confronting him, but the thought of hearing his explanation, whatever it might be, made her stomach churn. Instead, she decided to wait and watch. If there was something to uncover, she wanted more than a single piece of paper. She wanted certainty. Her opportunity came unexpectedly. Daniel had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter before heading to work, and when Noah spilled juice, Claire grabbed a towel and moved it out of the way. The screen was still lit, showing his email inbox. She hesitated, telling herself it was wrong to look, but her eyes caught on a subject line: Thursday afternoon, can't wait. There was no name, just the initial S next to the sender's email address. She didn't open the message, but the few words she had seen were enough to confirm that her unease wasn't unfounded. That afternoon, after Sophie left and Noah was napping, Claire sat at her desk and began researching home security cameras. She told herself it was for Noah's safety, and technically it was, but her real reason was different. She found a small camera designed to blend into a bookshelf and ordered it with overnight shipping. When it arrived, she placed it in the living room, angled to capture both the couch and the entry to the kitchen. She said nothing to Daniel about it. The first few days yielded nothing out of the ordinary. Sophie played with Noah, read him stories, and tittied up. Daniel came home at his usual time, and their interactions were polite and distant in Claire's presence. But on the fourth day, Claire caught something on the footage that made her hands go cold. Daniel had arrived home earlier than expected, and Sophie was in the kitchen cleaning up. He walked in, said something that made her laugh, and as she passed by him, his hand lingered at her waist. It was subtle, quick, but intimate in a way that spoke of familiarity. Claire replayed the moment several times, her stomach knotting tighter with each viewing. There was no longer any doubt in her mind. She didn't confront them immediately. Instead, she decided to gather more. Over the next week, she collected small pieces, Daniel leaning in too close to speak to Sophie, the way their eyes locked a little too long, Sophie touching his arm in a way that was casual but far from necessary. Claire saved every clip, creating a quiet archive of betrayal on her computer. The more evidence she collected, the more her emotions shifted. At first, it was shock, then anger. But as the days passed, her feelings grew colder, more deliberate. She no longer felt like the victim of a blindside. She felt like someone preparing for a battle. She began to look at Daniel differently, not with open rage, but with the detached observation of someone studying an opponent. Sophie, too, was no longer just the nanny. She was an intruder who had crossed into the most private part of Claire's life and settled there as though she belonged. One evening, while Daniel was in the shower, Claire searched his phone. She knew the passcode, a remnant of trust from better days. In his messages, she found a thread between him and Sophie filled with short, careful phrases. Same time? Can't stop thinking about earlier. Don't say anything. Just act normal. Each one was like a match striking inside her chest. She took screenshots, saved them to a hidden folder, and put his phone back exactly as she had found it. By now, Claire had stopped asking herself whether she was imagining things. She wasn't. She had the truth in her hands, in both images and video. What she didn't yet have was a plan for what to do with it. Confronting Daniel might end the affair, but it wouldn't erase the betrayal, and it wouldn't stop Sophie from seeking another opening to step back into their lives. Claire wanted something more permanent. Her mind began to drift toward ideas she would have once considered unthinkable. She didn't want just to expose them, she wanted to control how the story ended. She started making quiet phone calls during the hours Sophie wasn't around, speaking to people she knew from her college days. One of them was now a private investigator, and after a short conversation, Claire hired him to dig into Sophie's background. She didn't explain everything, just said she had concerns about the person watching her child. The results came back within a week, and they were worse than Claire had expected. Sophie had worked for another family in a different town, and the job had ended abruptly after the wife accused her of having an inappropriate relationship with the husband. No charges had been filed, but there had been a financial settlement. Sophie's last name had even been changed after that incident. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was a pattern. The knowledge hardened something inside Claire. She now saw Sophie not as a young woman who had made a bad choice, but as a predator who sought out vulnerable situations. That realization removed the last traces of hesitation from her mind. The only question left was how and when to act. She began to think of ways to put Sophie in a position where the truth would come out without Claire having to be the one to reveal it directly. She didn't share any of this with Daniel. She treated him exactly the same, smiling when necessary, speaking politely, making it seem as though nothing had changed. If he suspected she knew, he gave no sign. Sophie, too, seemed unaware, moving through the house with her usual cheerfulness. But in Claire's mind, the days were no longer normal. They were numbered. She had the proof, she had the background, and now she had the resolve. The only thing left was to set everything in motion. And when she did, there would be no way for either of them to undo it. The perfect image of the Reeves family had already been broken. Soon, the illusion would be shattered beyond repair. Claire's decision to act came quietly, without the storm of rage she had once imagined. It wasn't a sudden outburst or a moment of uncontrollable emotion. It was a steady, deliberate resolve, like the slow tightening of a knot. She had already learned that anger could burn out quickly, but patience could cut far deeper. She began by creating a surface of calm that masked everything she knew. Around Daniel, she kept her tone light, her questions casual. Around Sophie, she remained polite, even warm at times. The illusion was essential. It would keep them both from suspecting they were being drawn into something they couldn't escape. Her first step was to make herself less present in the house without raising suspicion. She took on extra freelance projects and arranged meetings outside the home, leaving Sophie and Daniel alone with more opportunities to interact. It was counterintuitive, but it was calculated. She needed them comfortable enough to stop guarding themselves, to believe they were operating without risk. The more they thought they were safe, the more careless they would become. Claire wanted that carelessness to be visible, undeniable, and damning. The camera in the living room had already given her plenty of material, but she added another one in the kitchen, disguised as a decorative jar on the counter. It was positioned to catch the small, incriminating gestures that might otherwise be dismissed as harmless. She didn't watch the footage daily. Instead, she let it accumulate, knowing the longer the recordings ran, the more compelling the story they would tell. In the meantime, she kept in touch with the private investigator. His findings on Sophie had been thorough, but Claire wanted more, not just what Sophie had done before, but any patterns, weaknesses, or vulnerabilities she could exploit. Within a week, she had a file that included financial records, a former roommate's statements, and even an old restraining order from a neighbor in her previous city. Sophie's image as the sweet, reliable caregiver was crumbling in Claire's mind, replaced by the portrait of someone reckless, opportunistic, and willing to cross any line. With the foundation in place, Claire began planting small seeds. At dinner, she would casually mention that she had bumped into an old friend who now worked in law enforcement. She would comment on how thorough background checks could reveal surprising things about people. She did this without looking directly at Sophie, but always when Sophie was within earshot. It wasn't an accusation, just a subtle reminder that secrets rarely stayed hidden forever. Daniel noticed none of this. He was drifting further into the comfort of Sophie's presence, unaware that every step closer to her was also a step deeper into the trap Claire was setting. He thought the changes in Claire's routine meant she was distracted, too busy with work to notice anything unusual. He had no idea she was deliberately engineering his false sense of security. Then came the dinner invitation. Claire presented it as a peace offering, a casual meal to thank Sophie for her help with Noah and to celebrate the completion of one of her big projects. She chose a Friday evening when she knew Daniel would be home early. Sophie accepted without hesitation, and Claire made sure the setting was perfect. Soft lighting, a well-prepared meal, and enough wine to lower inhibitions without crossing into obvious intoxication. Throughout the evening, Claire played her role perfectly. She laughed at small jokes, shared light stories, and never hinted at the storm building beneath her calm surface. Daniel and Sophie seemed relaxed, falling into their familiar, too comfortable rhythm. Claire poured more wine and kept the conversation flowing, all the while observing every movement, every glance. She knew the cameras were capturing it all. As the night went on, Claire subtly excused herself to check on Noah, leaving Daniel and Sophie alone in the kitchen. From her position just out of sight, she could hear the low hum of their voices, the occasional soft laugh. She didn't need to see them. The cameras would provide the visuals later. When she returned, both looked slightly flushed, though they quickly resumed their places as if nothing had happened. Claire ended the evening with warmth, thanking Sophie for joining them and walking her to the door. It was the last friendly gesture she intended to offer. After Sophie left, Claire began reviewing the footage from that night. It was exactly what she had expected: the lingering touches, the looks exchanged when they thought they were alone, the easy intimacy that went far beyond professional boundaries. It was another piece in the growing puzzle, and by now, the picture was almost complete. The next phase required precision. Claire began compiling the footage, messages, and background details into a single, chronological file. She worked late at night when Daniel was asleep, her computer screen glowing in the dim light of her office. She wasn't just collecting evidence. She was shaping a narrative, one that would make it impossible for Daniel or Sophie to deny what they had done. Her plan was not to confront them directly. That would give them a chance to spin their own version of events. Instead, she intended to let the truth unfold in a way that would leave them no escape, no room to rewrite history. She knew exactly when it would happen and exactly who would see it first. But even with everything in motion, Claire felt the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about control, about ensuring that the people who had undermined her life would face the consequences on her terms. There was no turning back. Every move from this point on would lead to an irreversible end. In the days that followed, Claire kept her demeanor steady. She made small talk with Sophie in the mornings, kissed Daniel on the cheek before he left for work, and maintained the image of a wife and mother content with her life. But inside, she was counting down. The dinner had shown her how close they were to becoming reckless enough for the final push. She only needed one more night, one more mistake, to finish what she had started. That night would come sooner than either of them expected. And when it did, it would mark the point where their secrets could no longer be hidden behind smiles and polite conversation. It would be the moment everything fell apart, exactly as Claire intended. The night began with a quiet, humid stillness that clung to the air like an unspoken warning. Claire had chosen this evening carefully, making sure all the elements lined up exactly as she wanted. Daniel had finished work early, his mood unusually light, and Sophie had agreed to come over under the pretense of helping with Noah's bedtime routine so Claire could focus on preparing a special dinner. There was nothing in her tone, nothing in her manner to suggest anything was out of the ordinary. It was all intentional. By the time Sophie arrived, the table was already set. The aroma of roasted chicken and herbs drifted through the house, mingling with the faint sound of a playlist playing softly in the background. Claire welcomed her in with the same polite warmth she had shown at their last dinner together. Sophie, unsuspecting, stepped inside without hesitation, her bag slung loosely over her shoulder, her smile easy. Daniel's eyes flicked toward her with that same look Claire had memorized, the one that betrayed far more than casual familiarity. She filed it away, just as she had every other detail. The evening unfolded slowly, almost deliberately. Claire kept the wine glasses filled, serving dishes passed around the table, conversation drifting from small talk about the weather to stories about Noah's latest antics. Daniel laughed more than usual, Sophie responding in kind. The air between them carried a tension that only Claire could fully feel, a subtle undercurrent masked by the clinking of cutlery and the soft scrape of chairs against the hardwood floor. It wasn't until the plates were cleared that the shift began. Claire suggested they all move to the kitchen for dessert, a simple fruit tart she had prepared earlier. The room was warmer there, the air thicker. She poured more wine, her hands steady, her voice even. The conversation slowed, and in those pauses, she could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing closer. She had orchestrated every moment up to this point, but the final act would unfold naturally, fueled by the very flaws that had brought them here. Noah was upstairs, fast asleep, the baby monitor on the counter emitting the faint, steady sound of his breathing. Claire stepped out briefly, claiming she needed to grab something from the pantry. In reality, she positioned herself just beyond the doorway, listening. Daniel's voice lowered, tinged with something soft, intimate. Sophie laughed quietly in response. The scrape of a chair, a sound brief, but telling that confirmed the physical closeness she'd anticipated. Claire waited, letting the silence stretch before reappearing, her face unreadable. She set the dessert on the counter, her movements deliberate. For a few moments, the three of them stood there, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tap of the rain beginning outside. Claire picked up her glass, took a slow sip, and then placed it down with a soft but distinct click against the counter. The tension in the room shifted. No one could later say what exactly triggered the escalation. It may have been something in Claire's expression, or the way Daniel's voice caught when he spoke. It might have been the subtle, sharp question she finally allowed herself to ask, one that stripped away any remaining illusion. Whatever it was, the conversation turned from strained to heated in seconds. Words spilled out, sharp and cutting. Accusations layered over denials, the voices rising with each exchange. Sophie's cheeks flushed, her tone defensive. Daniel's face hardened, his hands clenched. The escalation was swift, the room shrinking around them. Claire stood her ground, her voice steady at first, then sharper. Sophie moved toward her, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to intimidate. The glass of wine in Sophie's hand sloshed slightly with the movement. Claire's gaze stayed locked, unflinching. The next moment unfolded in a blur. Sophie's arm jerked upward, whether in a careless gesture or something more deliberate. No one could agree later, and the glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the counter. In that same instant, Daniel stepped between them, his arm sweeping forward. There was a thud, a sound like something heavy dropping to the floor, followed by a silence so sudden it seemed to swallow the air from the room. Sophie lay sprawled on the tiles, her head turned at an unnatural angle, dark hair spilling across the shards of glass. A thin ribbon of blood trickled from her temple. Daniel froze, his breathing shallow, eyes wide. Claire didn't move for several seconds, her expression unreadable as she took in the scene. The rain outside had grown heavier, pattering steadily against the kitchen windows. The knock at the door came minutes later, quick and urgent. It was the neighbor, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the crash. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene through the doorway before quickly calling the police. When the sirens came, their wail cut through the night, growing louder until red and blue lights flickered through the front windows. The officers moved quickly, securing the scene, checking Sophie for signs of life. But it was too late. Daniel sat against the wall, his hands trembling, the sleeves of his shirt stained with her blood. Claire stood near the doorway, her arms folded loosely, her face pale but calm. She answered questions quietly, without hesitation, her account measured and precise. The investigation began immediately. Forensics teams combed through the kitchen, photographing the broken glass, collecting fingerprints, analyzing blood patterns. The medical examiner's preliminary report noted that Sophie's injury was consistent with a forceful impact, not a simple fall. The positioning of her body, the angle of the wound, and the distribution of glass fragments all pointed toward deliberate contact. Daniel insisted it was an accident, that he had simply tried to push Sophie back during the argument and she had fallen. But the evidence painted a different picture, one that left little room for his version of events. The footage from the hidden cameras, discovered during the search, added layers of complexity. It revealed the closeness between Daniel and Sophie over weeks, the subtle exchanges, the touches that spoke of more than a professional relationship. The story spread quickly through Clearwater Bay, the once perfect image of the Reeves family shattering in the public eye. Neighbors who had envied their home and lifestyle now whispered in hushed tones about betrayal, deceit, and the deadly consequences that had followed. Claire, though central to the events, emerged with an air of quiet detachment, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of what had happened. When the charges came, they were for involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution argued that Daniel's actions, though perhaps not premeditated, were reckless and resulted directly in Sophie's death. The defense tried to frame the incident as a tragic accident during a heated moment, but the combination of forensic evidence and the damning video footage left little room for doubt. Daniel's trial became a local spectacle, every detail picked apart in court and in the press. Claire testified with composure, recounting the evening in clear, deliberate terms, never once showing the depth of emotion the jury might have expected from a grieving wife. When the verdict came guilty, there was no outburst, no visible relief, only a quiet nod from Claire as though the outcome had been decided long before the trial began. After sentencing, the house in Clearwater Bay stood silent, its windows dark, its garden overgrown. The perfect family that had once lived there was gone, replaced by a story the town would tell for years. How love curdled into betrayal, how betrayal bled into violence, and how in the end no one walked away unscathed. Claire never spoke publicly about the night again, but those who knew her suspected that nothing in it had been left to chance. Whether Daniel's act had been spontaneous or part of a chain reaction she had quietly set in motion remained a matter of speculation, one more unanswered question in a story already full of them.